There is a place where the land gives up entirely, where the last stubborn granite finally surrenders to the pull and weight of the sea. And it is here, on such a point, that our story begins. Picture it now, if you will, in the soft, dimming light of a late autumn evening. A finger of dark rock extends into water the color of pewter, waves rising and falling against its base in a rhythm older than any human memory. Spray catches the last light of a dying sun, hanging in the air like suspended breath before falling back into the churning grey below. And rising from this rock, improbable and solitary, stands a tower. It is not a grand structure, not by the measures we might use today. Perhaps 60 feet of dressed stone, tapering gently as it climbs its surface, weathered by a century of salt and wind. At its crown, a glass chamber catches what remains of the daylight, and within that chamber, though we cannot yet see it clearly from this distance, a flame flickers into being. It is small at first, uncertain, the way all flames are uncertain in their infancy, but it steadies, it grows, and soon it casts its light outward across the water in a slow, deliberate sweep, a single beam turning through the gathering dark like the hand of some vast and patient clock. This is the moment we return to again and again in the story of the lighthouse keeper. Not the drama of shipwreck, though that will come, not the isolation, though we will sit with that too in the long hours of winter darkness. But this, the simple, quiet miracle of a light being lit against the dark by a single pair of hands in a place where almost no one will ever see it happen. To understand what this light meant, we must first understand the world it existed within. A world quite different from our own, though not so very long ago, in the grand sweep of human history. We speak now of the 18th and 19th centuries, an age when the sea was not a leisure destination or a subject for postcards, but the very lifeblood of nations. Trade moved by water because there was no other way to move it in such volume, across such distance. Grain from one coast to feed the hungry cities of another. Timber and coal and cotton, wool and spices and letters, carrying news of births and deaths across oceans that took weeks, sometimes months, to cross. Empires rose and fell on the strength of their shipping lanes. Fortunes were made and lost in the holds of vessels that might never arrive at all, and this was the danger always, lurking beneath the surface of every voyage, the coast itself. For all that, the open ocean seemed the greater peril, with its storms and its endless grey distances. It was often the land that proved fatal, the sudden shoal beneath calm water, the hidden reef that had claimed ships for generations. The rocky headland, invisible in fog or darkness, until the moment a hull met stone and the sea rushed in to claim what remained. Sailors who had crossed 1,000 miles of open water without incident might find their journey ended within sight of home, undone by a coastline they could not see. It was against this danger that the lighthouse stood as humanity's quiet answer. Not a solution to the sea's power, nothing could claim that, but a mitigation, a warning, a single point of certainty in an uncertain world. Before satellites traced their invisible paths above the earth, before radio waves carried position and warning across the water in an instant, before the glowing screens of modern navigation made the coastline knowable at a glance, there was only this: a flame tended by human hands, burning through the night so that those at sea might know where the safe water ended and the deadly rocks began. Consider what this meant to a sailor standing watch on a merchant vessel 3 weeks out from port, exhausted and uncertain of his position after days of overcast skies that had denied any glimpse of sun or star by which to navigate. Consider the relief, no, the profound and bodily relief of spotting, at last, on the black horizon, a single pulse of light. Not just any light, but a specific light, one whose pattern of flashes he had memorized before ever leaving port, because each lighthouse spoke its own particular language of illumination, and to know that language was to know exactly where one stood in relation to danger and safety alike. 3 flashes, then darkness, a steady beam that rotated once every 20 seconds. A red light here, a white light there, each combination unique to its station, catalogued in the mariner's charts and committed to memory by those whose lives depended on such knowledge. This was the world that made lighthouses necessary, and it was a world hungry for them. Along coastlines that had claimed ships and lives for centuries, the rocky shores of Cornwall, the fog-bound points of Nova Scotia, the shifting sandbars off the American coast, the storm-battered headlands of Scotland and Scandinavia, governments and trading companies alike began to see the wisdom, and indeed the necessity, of marking these places of danger with permanent, reliable lights. What followed across the latter decades of the 18th century and through much of the 19th was what we might call the golden age of lighthouse building, an era of extraordinary engineering ambition in which towers were raised on rocks so remote and so exposed that the mere act of construction seemed to defy reason. But a lighthouse, however brilliantly engineered, however soundly built, is nothing more than an inert structure without the presence of a particular kind of person, someone willing to live in these remote and often punishing places, someone willing to tend the flame through storm and fog and the long isolation of winter, someone for whom the maintenance of light itself would become not merely an occupation, but a calling, a way of life, an identity that would shape everything else about how they moved through the world. This is the lighthouse keeper, and it is to this figure that our story now turns its attention. There is something worth pausing on here, something worth sitting with in the quiet of this evening as we begin our journey together. The keeper was, in most respects, an entirely ordinary person, not a hero in the traditional sense, not someone whose name would appear in the history books alongside admirals and explorers and captains of great vessels. Often they came from humble origins, fishermen who knew the sea's moods intimately, former sailors whose bodies had grown too weathered for continued service at sea, but whose knowledge of maritime life remained invaluable. Sometimes even women, widows of sailors themselves, who took up the keeping of a light because they understood, perhaps better than most, exactly what such a light meant to those still out on the water. And yet, in their ordinariness, they carried an extraordinary weight of responsibility. Each night, as the sun sank into the sea and darkness spread across the water, it fell to this single person, or perhaps a small family, to ensure that the light did not fail. Not because of ceremony, not because of tradition, but because somewhere out there, in the vast and indifferent dark, there might be a ship, perhaps many ships, whose survival depended entirely on that light continuing to burn, continuing to turn, continuing to send its warning across the water with the same unwavering reliability that the tides themselves displayed. Think of what this meant, practically speaking, for the person who held this responsibility. It meant a life governed not by the ordinary rhythms of daylight and rest that most humans have known throughout history, but by the specific and unforgiving schedule of the lamp itself. Quote, "It meant hours spent trimming wicks, cleaning glass, adjusting mechanisms, hauling oil up narrow spiral staircases in weather that might make such a climb genuinely dangerous. It meant nights of vigilance, watching the light not simply to admire its glow, but to ensure, with almost obsessive attention, that nothing interrupted its steady turning. For a light that failed, even for a single hour, might mean a ship lost, sailors drowned, families elsewhere robbed of husbands and fathers and sons who would never come home. It meant, too, an isolation that most of us today, can barely comprehend. Many lighthouses stood on rocks so remote that months might pass without a visitor, without fresh supplies, without any human contact beyond the keeper's own family, if family there was. The nearest town might be visible only as a smudge on a distant shore, close enough to see, and yet, in the fiercest weather, entirely unreachable. This was not simply a job, in other words. It was a form of life set apart from ordinary human society, governed by different rules, demanding different qualities of character, patience above all, and a particular comfort with solitude that not every person possessed. And yet, for all of this isolation, for all of this quiet and unglamorous labor, the keeper occupied a position of genuine importance in the great machinery of maritime life. They were in the truest sense guardians, not of treasure, not of secrets, but of something far more valuable, the safety of strangers they would never meet, sailors whose faces they would never see, whose names they would never know, whose gratitude, if it came at all, might arrive only as a distant ship's horn, sounding once in acknowledgement as it passed safely through waters that might otherwise have claimed it. This, then, is the world we will spend our time in together tonight, the world of the lighthouse and the person who tended it, the golden age of maritime trade and the quiet heroism that made it possible, the towers built on impossible rocks, and the ordinary people who made them extraordinary, through nothing more than their steady, patient presence. If this kind of quiet history appeals to you, if you find comfort in these slow unfoldings of forgotten lives and vanished ways of being, I invite you to stay with us a while longer, and perhaps to remain with this channel for the histories yet to come, stories that ask for nothing more than your quiet attention. Offered here in the same spirit as the light itself, steady, patient, and always waiting for whoever might need it. For now, let us return to our tower on its rocky point, to the flame just kindled in its glass chamber, and to the person whose hands lit it. Let us discover how such towers came to be built at all, in places where building seemed almost impossible, and how ordinary men and women came to devote their lives to the keeping of light against darkness. Long before any tower could rise from stone, the coastlines of the world kept their own dark ledger of loss. Merchant captains knew certain waters by reputation alone, waters where charts grew vague and local fishermen crossed themselves before speaking their names. Reefs that lay just beneath the surface at high tide, invisible until a hull found them. Headlands that jutted into shipping lanes with no more warning than a bonfire lit by chance on some fisherman's beach. For centuries, the answer to this danger had been improvised and human. A widow keeping a fire burning on a cliff in memory of a husband lost, a monastery ringing its bell into fog, a coastal village lighting braziers not entirely out of charity, for the wrecks that came ashore were sometimes harvested as much as mourned. The sea gave nothing freely, and in the poorer stretches of coastline, a shipwreck might feed a village through a hard winter. This uncomfortable truth would come to matter later, when the first proposals for permanent lights met resistance, not from nature, but from the very communities meant to benefit. By the 18th century, the pressure to solve this problem had become impossible to ignore. Trade had grown vast and impatient. Insurers in London and Amsterdam tallied their losses each season and found the numbers climbing, ships bound for the Indies, for the Baltic, for the American colonies going down. Not in battle, but in darkness, on rocks that had claimed vessels for as long as anyone could remember. Governments began to see what the merchants already knew, that a coastline without light was a coastline that taxed every ambition of empire. And so, gradually, awkwardly, through a mixture of royal charter, private enterprise, and public shame, the great age of lighthouse building began. Men who had never gone to sea found themselves drawn into a strange new profession, one that required the patience of an engineer, the faith of a missionary, and something closer to the nerve of a soldier. For the places that most needed light were, without exception, the places most hostile to being reached. Among all these dangerous places, one came to occupy a particular kind of infamy along the eastern coast of Scotland, in the waters near the mouth of the River Tay. It was known as the Inchcape Rock, though most sailors called it by a plainer, more honest name, the Bell Rock. It was not truly an island. It was a long reef of sandstone, submerged beneath the waves for all but a few hours at low tide, lying directly in the path of ships making their way toward Dundee, Leith, and the ports beyond. For centuries it had waited beneath the surface like something patient and unbothered by time, and for centuries it had taken ships with a regularity that turned into legend. A medieval story told of an abbot who once placed a warning bell upon the rock, tethered to a floating buoy, so that its ringing in rough weather might warn sailors of the danger beneath them, until a pirate, so the tale went, cut the bell loose out of spite, and drowned himself on the very same rock years later, caught by the tide he had once mocked. Whether the story was true mattered less than what it revealed. That even in an age of superstition, people understood that this particular stretch of water demanded acknowledgement. It could not simply be sailed past and forgotten. By the closing years of the 18th century, the losses at Bell Rock had grown severe enough that the Board of Northern Lighthouses, newly formed and determined, began to seriously consider what many regarded as an impossible task: building a permanent lighthouse not on the coast, not on a cliff, dock, a stone finger raised from a rock that vanished twice a day beneath the tide. The man who would eventually take on this work was an engineer named Robert Stevenson, young, serious, and driven by a conviction that the thing everyone called impossible was simply a problem no one had yet solved with sufficient care. He would go on to found a family dynasty of lighthouse engineers whose descendants would illuminate coastlines across Scotland for 100 years, though in these early days he was still proving himself. Still gathering the evidence and the courage necessary to propose something that had never quite been attempted in these waters. A tower built not beside the sea, but within it. The construction that followed, beginning in 1807, remains one of the most patient and dangerous engineering efforts of its age. There was no solid ground to work from. The rock itself was submerged for all but a few hours each day, and even then only when the tide and weather cooperated, which in that stretch of the North Sea was never something to be relied upon. The workers, masons, quarrymen, blacksmiths, and labourers lived not on the rock, but on a ship anchored nearby. A converted vessel that rolled and pitched through every storm that passed, offering little more comfort than the sea itself. Each morning, when conditions allowed, they would be rowed out to the reef in small boats, timed with exacting precision so as to arrive just as the rock began to emerge from the retreating tide. They had perhaps 3 hours, sometimes less, before the sea reclaimed its ground, and the men were forced back into the boats. Their work interrupted mid-motion, tools left wedged into crevices to await the next low tide. The stone for the tower could not simply be quarried nearby, for there was no nearby to speak of, only the endless grey water and the low, dark shape of the reef, breaking the surface like the back of some vast and patient animal. Instead, the stone was cut inland, at quarries in Aberdeen and elsewhere, shaped with extraordinary precision into interlocking blocks designed to withstand not only the crushing weight of the tower above them, but the relentless battering of waves that would strike the base of the structure with the full unbroken force of the North Sea. These blocks were transported by boat across sometimes dangerous water, unloaded with cranes rigged directly onto the exposed rock during the brief windows of low tide, and fitted together by masons working with a speed and precision that left little room for error, for a stone set wrong in July might not be correctable until the following spring. When weather again permitted work to resume, storms delayed everything, as storms always did. There were weeks when the sea refused to calm long enough for a single boat to approach the rock, weeks when the barrack built precariously atop temporary iron supports, the only shelter the workers had once enough of the tower existed to support it, swayed and groaned under wind that seemed intent on erasing every trace of human ambition from that stretch of water. Men fell ill. Men grew weary of the isolation, the endless rocking of the accommodation ship, the sight of their work half-finished and vulnerable each time they were forced to retreat. And yet the work continued, season after season, block by interlocking block, until the tower began to take a shape that could be seen from the mainland, a slender grey column rising improbably from what still looked, at low tide, like nothing more than a dark smear upon the water. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this description, to imagine what it must have looked like from a passing ship. Masons balanced on scaffolding, erected atop bare rock, ropes stretching down into small boats bobbing against the swell, a crane creaking as it lifted another dressed stone into place, all of it framed by grey sky and greyer sea. The whole scene looking less like a construction site than some strange ritual being performed at the edge of the known world. There was no romance in it for the men doing the work, only cold hands, salt-cracked skin, the constant awareness of tide tables, and the low hum of danger that never fully left the place, no matter how routine the labor became. And yet something patient and almost reverent moved through the project nonetheless, a sense among those involved that they were building not merely a structure, but a kind of promise, a fixed point of light that would outlast every one of them, standing long after their names had been forgotten by all but the driest engineering records. The tower rose slowly through 1808 through 1809 through 1810, each season adding height, each winter testing what had been built against it. And at last, in February of 1811, after 4 years of labor conducted almost entirely within the narrow, tide-bound hours the sea, consented to grant the light atop Bell Rock was lit for the first time. It shone out across the black water where for centuries ships had foundered without warning, its beam turning steadily through the dark, visible to vessels many miles distant, a signal that this particular stretch of the North Sea had, at last, been given a voice. The keepers who would come to serve there, for a light, once lit, requires someone to tend it, inherited a tower unlike almost any other in the world, a place reachable only by boat, only in calm weather, standing alone upon a rock that disappeared beneath the sea twice each day, as if the ocean itself still resented its presence. To understand what it meant to live in such a place, we must first understand who these keepers were, and how a person came to choose, or was chosen for, a life spent almost entirely within the reach of the tide, the light, and the long silence between passing ships. They came from many directions, though the sea itself sent the greatest number. Former sailors made up a large portion of the keeping profession throughout the 19th century. Men who had spent decades reading the water from the deck of a ship, and who found in the lighthouse service a way to remain near the element that had shaped them without submitting any longer to its constant motion. A sailor's body grew accustomed to a particular relationship with the sea, vigilant, respectful, never fully at ease, and that same disposition served him well in a tower where the water was always visible, always audible, always a presence rather than a backdrop. These men understood weather in ways that could not be taught from a manual. They could smell a change in the air hours before the barometer confirmed it, could read the color of a cloud bank, and know whether it promised rain or something worse. The lighthouse services of Britain, France, and the American coast often preferred former mariners for exactly this reason. valuing the instinctive knowledge that came from years spent surviving the sea, rather than merely observing it from shore. But sailors were not the only ones drawn to the keeping life. Widowers appeared in the records with a frequency that suggests something particular about grief and solitude. Men who had lost wives to illness or childbirth and found that the ordinary rhythms of town life, the market square, the church bell, the neighbors' well-meaning inquiries had become unbearable in their emptiness. For such men, a remote station offered not escape from sorrow, but a place where sorrow could exist without needing to be explained. The work demanded attention, structure, and physical labor, and grief could be carried more easily inside a life that required something of you every single day. Other keepers were younger, unmarried, drawn less by loss than by a native quietness of temperament. People who had always felt slightly apart from the noise of ordinary society and who recognized in the advertisement for a keeper's position a kind of permission to live according to their own nature rather than against it. Women too became keepers, though their numbers were smaller and their paths into the role often less direct. Many arrived as wives who found themselves solely responsible for the light after a husband's illness or death, only to be formally appointed once the authorities recognized that the work was already being done, and done well. A smaller number were appointed independently, their applications considered on the same technical grounds as any man's. Could they trim a wick evenly? Could they keep a log with precision? Could they haul oil up a spiral stair without complaint? The historical record contains women who kept lights alone for years, who rowed out in weather that turned back rescue boats, who came to be trusted by the maritime authorities more completely than many of their male counterparts, precisely because their competence had been tested so thoroughly and so often against assumption. Whoever they were, and whatever brought them to apply, all candidates for the position of keeper faced a selection process that combined practical examination with an almost intangible assessment of character. Lighthouse authorities, whether Trinity House in England, the Commissioners of Northern Lighthouses in Scotland, or the Lighthouse Board in the United States, understood early on that the technical requirements of the job, while considerable, were not the primary obstacle to a keeper's success. A man could learn to trim a wick, to polish a lens, to record a barometric reading with perfect accuracy in a matter of weeks. What could not be taught, and what every application quietly attempted to measure, was whether a person could endure. Endurance meant more than physical hardiness, though that mattered too. A keeper needed to climb the tower stairs dozens of times a day, to carry oil and coal up narrow spirals in weather that made the steps slick, to stand through hours of watch in cold that seeped through every layer of wool. Endurance also meant psychological steadiness, the capacity to remain calm and attentive through weeks of isolation, through storms that rattled the tower's very stones, through the particular strain of days when the fog never lifted and the world beyond the light simply ceased. Training, where it existed formally, tended to be brief and practical rather than exhaustive. A candidate might spend several weeks under the supervision of an experienced keeper, learning the specific mechanisms of the station's particular lamp, for lighthouse technology varied considerably from tower to tower, and a man trained on one type of apparatus might find himself entirely unfamiliar with another. He would learn to clean the lens without scratching its delicate surface, to trim the wick to the precise height that produced the clearest flame without excessive smoke, to refill the oil reservoirs on a schedule that could not be permitted to lapse even by an hour. He would learn to keep the log, a document that lighthouse authorities regarded with almost religious seriousness, for the log recorded not only the weather and the light's performance, but any ship sighted, any distress signal observed, any incident that might later prove significant to an inquiry or a court. A keeper's handwriting, his precision, his willingness to record even the most uneventful of days with the same care as the most dramatic, became a kind of quiet testament to his suitability for the post. Beyond these practical skills, keepers were expected to master a body of knowledge that ranged from basic meteorology to rudimentary mechanics, from first aid to the maintenance of small boats, from semaphore signaling to the repair of stonework damaged by salt and storm. At the more isolated stations, and Eilean Moor, sitting alone in its exposed Atlantic waters, certainly qualified among the most isolated a keeper, needed to be capable of solving nearly any problem that arose, because help might be weeks away, dependent entirely on the mercy of the weather and the willingness of a relief boat. It was into this demanding and peculiar profession that a man named Donald MacArthur entered in the final years of the 19th century, one of 3 keepers who would eventually serve together at the Light on Eilean Moor, and whose presence there gives us a human thread to follow through the tower's early years. MacArthur was, by the accounts that survive him, a solidly built man, given to few words, respected among his fellow keepers for a steadiness that seemed to owe something to his years at sea before he ever applied for lighthouse work. Like many who entered the service, he had grown up along the western coast of Scotland, in a fishing family whose relationship with the ocean had always carried both provision and threat in equal measure. He had seen storms take boats, he knew, had watched neighbours go out and simply not return, and had developed, perhaps as a consequence, an unusual comfort with solitude and a wariness of superstition that would later be remembered, ironically, for reasons that had nothing to do with his character and everything to do with the mystery that would eventually surround the station he served. MacArthur applied for the lighthouse service in his 30s, a slightly older candidate than many, but one whose maritime background made him an appealing choice to the examining board. He passed the technical assessments without particular distinction. His handwriting was serviceable rather than elegant, his knowledge of the mechanisms adequate rather than exceptional. But his interview, according to a supervisor's brief surviving note, revealed a temperament well suited to isolated duty, calm in manner, unlikely to be troubled by solitude. This single phrase, tucked into an administrative file that has otherwise faded into obscurity, gives us perhaps the clearest window available into what the authorities were truly searching for when they selected men and women for the loneliest postings in the service. Technical competence could be assumed of anyone willing to endure the training. Temperament could not. For MacArthur, as for so many who entered the service, the decision to accept a posting at a station as remote as Eilean Moor carried with it a complicated blend of hope and quiet apprehension. The pay, while modest, was steady, a rare thing in the uncertain economy of coastal fishing communities, where a single bad season could mean genuine hardship. The work carried a measure of dignity too. A keeper was understood by his community to perform a service of real consequence, protecting ships and sailors from a fate that everyone along that coast had witnessed too many times. There was pride available in the role, a sense of purpose that not every occupation offered. And yet, beneath the practical hopes lay something more difficult to articulate, a low current of apprehension that surely accompanied every keeper's first approach to a station as isolated as this one. To accept such a post was to accept a fundamental alteration in the shape of one's life, an agreement to be, for long stretches, entirely apart from the ordinary comforts of company, of variety, of the small, unplanned interactions that fill most human days without anyone noticing their value until they are gone. It meant trusting the sea to allow safe passage for supply boats on a schedule it did not always honor. It meant trusting one's own mind to remain steady through the peculiar psychological weather of extended solitude, a test that not every man or woman discovered they could pass until they were already out upon the rock, already watching the boat that had brought them recede toward a shore that might not be visible again for weeks. MacArthur, along with the men who would eventually serve beside him, carried these hopes and apprehensions with him when he first accepted his posting. Unaware, as all new keepers were unaware, of precisely what the tower would ask of him, or what long, quiet, uneventful years might precede whatever moment, if any, would test him beyond the limits of his training. He knew only that he was leaving behind the noise and companionship of ordinary life for a discipline that demanded patience above all else, and that somewhere out past the grey water a rock was waiting, and upon that rock a light that needed tending. The boat that carried him out was smaller than he had imagined, a working vessel with a low freeboard and a smell of tar and fish that clung to the wood long after the catch had been sold elsewhere. The waterman who piloted it had made this crossing hundreds of times before, ferrying supplies and mail and the occasional relief keeper out to the rock, and he handled the tiller with the unbothered ease of a man for whom the sea's moods. The keeper sat amidships with his trunk lashed beside him, containing what few possessions the posting allowed: a change of clothes, a Bible, letters from home he had not yet found the courage to read again, a small collection of tools he had been told he might need, though no one had specified for what. The water beyond the harbour mouth turned quickly from the flat grey-green of the sheltered channel to something darker and more restless, swells rising beneath the hull with a rhythm that had no pattern a landsman could predict. He gripped the gunwale without meaning to, and the waterman, noticing, said nothing, only adjusted the tiller slightly and let the boat find its own way through the chop. For the better part of an hour, there was nothing to see but water and the low smudge of clouds pressing down toward the horizon. And the keeper found himself wondering, not for the first time, whether he had misjudged the scale of what he was undertaking. He had read the notices, had spoken with the superintendent who oversaw such postings, had even met briefly with a retired keeper who offered advice delivered in the clipped, economical sentences of a man long accustomed to solitude. Trim the wick before dusk, keep the log even when there is nothing to log. None of it had prepared him for the particular sensation of watching land disappear behind him while nothing yet appeared ahead to replace it. He was, for that hour, suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, and the sensation settled into him with a weight he had not anticipated. Then, cresting a swell higher than the others, he saw it. A vertical line against the horizon, pale and indistinct, easily mistaken at first for a trick of the light or a distant sail. But as the boat continued, and the swells lifted him higher at intervals, the line resolved itself into something unmistakably built, a tower rising from a knuckle of rock that seemed, at this distance, entirely too small to support it. The waterman noticed him looking and offered, unprompted, the kind of observation that passed for conversation among men who spent their lives on this stretch of water, that the rock had claimed 3 vessels in living memory before the tower went up, and none since, which was as close to gratitude as such men allowed themselves, toward a structure that gave them nothing but the negative comfort of disaster avoided. The tower grew slowly, the way distant things grow when approached by water, each apparent increase in size feeling both sudden and inevitable. He began to make out details, the banding of dark and light stone, the small windows spiraling upward in irregular intervals, the gallery ringing the lantern room like a collar, the lantern itself catching what little sun broke through the overcast and throwing it back in a dull glint that seemed less like reflection than acknowledgement, as though the tower had noted his approach and permitted it. The rock beneath the tower revealed itself only in the final stretch of the crossing, low black shelf, perpetually wet with spray, offering no beach, no gentle gradient, nothing that could be called a shore in any hospitable sense. The waterman brought the boat alongside a mooring ring bolted into the stone, with the same unhurried competence he had shown throughout the crossing, and for a moment the keeper simply sat, trunk beside him, and looked up at the tower he would now call his post. The transfer from boat to rock was its own small trial, timed to the rise and fall of the swell, requiring a leap onto slick stone the moment the boat's motion offered its briefest agreement with the rock's stillness. He managed it without incident, though his trunk arrived a moment later with less grace, hauled up by a line and deposited with a thud that seemed to echo off the tower's base. The outgoing keeper, whom he was meant to relieve, met him at the base of the tower door, a man some 15 years his senior, weathered in the particular way of those who had spent long stretches away from wind-sheltered life, his handshake brief and his manner economical, but simpling neither warmth nor coldness, but simply the practiced transition of one man handing his post to another. Inside, the tower's cold struck him first, a damp chill that seemed to live in the very stone, regardless of season, and then the smell, a thick, particular combination of whale oil and brass polish and salt that had worked its way into every surface over years of use, mixing with something mineral from the stone itself, a scent that he would come in time to associate so completely with the tower that he would notice its absence more than its presence, the way one stops smelling one's own house. The stairwell spiraled upward with a tightness that required a hand on the rope rail bolted to the inner wall, each step slightly uneven in a way that spoke of the tower's age and the imperfect tools with which it had been built. He climbed past the storage rooms where oil casks and coal and provisions were kept, past the small chamber that would serve as his sleeping quarters, its single window offering a slice of grey sky and greyer water, past the kitchen with its iron stove bolted to the floor against the tower's occasional tremor in high wind, until at last he reached the lens room itself. Here, the outgoing keeper paused, as though sensing that this room required a different kind of introduction than the others. The lens dominated the space, an assembly of prisms and glass rings mounted in brass, taller than a man and catching what light there was in fractured prismatic slivers. Beneath it, the clockwork mechanism that turned the lens sat housed in its own casing, and even now, at rest, it seemed to hum faintly with the memory of motion, a mechanical heartbeat that the outgoing keeper explained would need winding every few hours through the night, the weights descending on their chains through a shaft cut into the tower's core, requiring a keeper to remain alert enough to reset them before they reached bottom and the light's rotation slowed or stopped entirely. He was shown the wick trimmers, the reservoir of oil, the small brush for the glass, the logbook with its columns for wind direction and barometric pressure and the passage of vessels. And he understood, standing there, that this room was the tower's true purpose and every other chamber existed only in service of it. He had come alone. Some keepers he knew brought wives and children to postings that allowed for family quarters, and he had heard both the advantages and hardships of this arrangement, discussed with equal conviction. The comfort of companionship weighed against the strain of raising children on a rock with no solid ground to run upon, no school beyond what a parent could provide from borrowed books. His own posting, at least for its first stretch, would be solitary, shared only with the other keeper who worked the alternating watch, a man he had not yet met, who was, at present, ashore on his period of leave and would return in a fortnight's time. Until then, the tower would hold only himself, and the isolation which he had anticipated intellectually as a fact of the position began now to settle into him as a physical sensation, a kind of pressure in the ears, not unlike the change in altitude, though he had never climbed anything higher than this tower to compare it to. The outgoing keeper did not linger. His relief accomplished, his own boat waiting, he offered a final few words of practical advice. Watch the fog signals mechanism. It sticks in damp weather. Don't trust the barometer alone. Watch the birds. They know before the glass does. And the wick oil runs low faster than the log suggests. Order more than seems necessary. Then he was gone, back down the spiraling stairs and out across the wet rock to the boat. And the keeper found himself standing alone in the lens room, listening to the mechanism's quiet tick, the wind pressing against the tower's stone with a sound like breath. He began, that first evening, to establish the rituals that would define the shape of his days and nights for as long as he held the post. He wound the clockwork mechanism as instructed, feeling the resistance of the weights through the crank, and watched the great lens begin its slow rotation, the light not yet lit, but the machinery already breathing its intended motion. Here, he trimmed the wick with the care of a man performing a task he suspected. He would perform badly at first, and well, eventually. And when dusk settled fully over the water, he lit the lamp and watched the beam extend outward across the darkening sea. Despite the cold and the isolation and the strangeness of the day, a small and unexpected satisfaction in having caused it. He recorded the wind direction in the log, the barometric reading, the temperature, in the neat, economical hand he had been trained to use, and understood that this entry was the first of what would become thousands, each one nearly identical to the last. Each one, small act of attention paid to a sea that gave no indication of noticing or caring whether it was watched. Outside, the light swept its slow circle over water that had, within the space of a single day, become something he was now responsible for. And he sat for a long while in the lens room's mechanical hum, listening to the tower settle around him, beginning to understand what it would mean to live inside a rhythm built entirely around light and darkness, and the patient, unglamorous work of keeping one from failing into the other. The rhythm revealed itself slowly in the manner of all things that are lived rather than learned, and by the end of his first month, the keeper had come to understand that a lighthouse day began not at dawn but somewhat before it, in the hour when the darkness was at its thinnest and most reluctant to leave. He woke, always, without the aid of any bell or clock, though a clock hung on the wall of his quarters, and ticked through the night with the patience of something that had counted far more hours than it would ever be thanked for. The body learned the schedule before the mind consented to it. He would open his eyes into the grey hush of the pre-dawn room, aware, in the way one is aware of one's own heartbeat, that above him the light was still turning, still throwing its beam out over water that could not yet be seen, and that this fact required him to rise. The climb to the lamp room was the same climb he had made, getting to bed some 4 or 5 hours before, the same worn stone steps curling upward inside the tower's narrow throat. But the climb felt different in this direction, going up into the coming day, rather than descending into sleep. His hand found the rope railing by habit, now no longer needing to search for it in the dark, and his feet had learned the particular unevenness of certain stairs, the one that dipped slightly at the 7th turn, the one that had been worn smooth and faintly slick by decades of ascending and descending boots. He passed the window slits one by one, each offering its narrow rectangle of sky, and watched the color change from black to the deep bruised blue that came before any true light, a color that seemed to belong to no particular hour, existing instead in a kind of suspended threshold between the night's authority and the day's. At the top, the lamp room received him the way it always did, close and warm and smelling of oil and heated metal, the lens still turning above its bed of mercury with a soft, mechanical patience that had not paused once in his absence. He had learned to extinguish the flame with a kind of care that bordered on tenderness, adjusting the wick down slowly rather than snuffing it out all at once, watching the light contract and dim and finally vanish, leaving only the grey shape of the burner and the faint ghost smell of extinguished fire hanging in the enclosed air. There was always a strange quiet in that moment, a small death performed daily. The light that had stood between 100 unseen ships and the rocks, now reduced to nothing more than a cooling piece of brass. He would stand for a moment in that quiet, watching the sky continue its slow brightening beyond the glass, before turning to the day's true labor. The lens itself demanded hours, not because the work was difficult in any singular sense, but because it was exacting in the way that only precision instruments can be exacting, punishing carelessness with smears and streaks that would, come nightfall, distort the beam meant to travel for miles across open water. He worked around its curved panels with soft cloths and polishing compounds, standing sometimes on a small ladder to reach the upper prisms, running his hands along glass that had been cut and fitted in a workshop somewhere in France or England, shipped across an ocean and assembled here on this exposed rock by men who had trusted that someone, someday, would care for it as carefully as they had built it. He came to know the lens in the particular way that one comes to know any object handled daily for years, its small flaws, the faint bubble trapped in one panel that had been there since before his arrival, the particular way the light caught certain facets and threw small rainbows across the walls when the sun struck it at mid-morning. He cleaned it, not because it was always visibly dirty, but because salt traveled invisibly on sea air, settling in a fine film that would not be noticed until it had already begun to dull the beam, and dulling, in this work, was its own kind of failure. Quieter than extinguishing, but no less dangerous to a ship relying on the light to be exactly as bright as it had been the night before. Beneath the lens room, in the storerooms that ringed the tower's lower levels, the oil waited in its heavy containers, and hauling it upward was a labor that never grew easier, no matter how many months passed. He carried it can by can up the winding stairs, his shoulders aching by the third or fourth trip, his breath coming shorter in the tower's confined air, and he learned to pace himself the way a man learns to pace himself before any task that must be repeated daily for the whole of a life, not rushing, not resting too long, finding some middle cadence that could be sustained without breaking him. The brass fittings of the lamp apparatus required polishing as well, an almost domestic labor performed high above the sea, rubbing at metal until it held a dull gleam, removing the salt tarnish that crept over everything exposed to the tower's air. His hands grew accustomed to the particular ache of this work, a soreness that lived mostly in the wrists and the base of the thumbs, and he noticed, without quite remarking on it to himself, that his hands were beginning to look like the hands of every other keeper he had ever seen, roughened, stained faintly with polish and oil, andapus, permanently marked by the tower's demands. It was in the small hours of the afternoon, when the light stood dark and cleaned and the oil replenished, that he came to the logbook, and this too became a ritual whose importance revealed itself only gradually. The book itself was plain, bound in a dark cover that had softened with handling. Its pages ruled into columns for date, time, wind, weather, and remarks, and into this ledger he entered, each day, the small facts of his watch, the wind direction and its rough strength, the state of the sea, whether calm or moderate or heavy, described in the clipped vocabulary that keepers before him had used, and that he now used without thinking, having absorbed it the way one absorbs any specialized language, through sheer repetition. He noted the ships sighted, when there were any to note, their approximate bearing and the direction of their travel, sometimes their type when he could make it out through the glass, a schooner running close to shore, a steamer trailing its long grey smoke along the horizon, a fishing vessel that passed close enough some evenings that he could see the shapes of men moving on her deck, though never close enough to make out a face. He noted supplies as well, what had come on the tender's last visit and what remained. The oil consumed and the oil left, a running arithmetic of sustenance that connected him, however faintly, to the mainland and the world of ledgers and shipments and other men's decisions about when he would next be resupplied. And he noted, too, the smaller things that did not strictly belong in any column, but that he recorded anyway in the margins or in the remarks space provided for whatever a keeper judged worth remembering, a flock of birds that had struck the lantern glass one night, disoriented by the light, and fallen stunned or dead onto the gallery, a particular quality of fog that had rolled in so thick one morning that the horn had sounded for 6 hours straight. A strange color the sunset had taken on an evening in autumn, streaked with a green he had never seen in a sky before or since. His entries were not required of him, not in any official sense, but he made them anyway, understanding without being told that the logbook was not merely an administrative record, but something closer to a diary of duty, a record of both the world outside his window and the passing of his own days, indistinguishable now from one another. He would sit with the book open before him at the small table in his quarters, the pen moving in slow, careful strokes, and there was something in the act of writing that steadied him, that gave shape to hours which might otherwise have dissolved into a single undifferentiated stretch of labor. The entries, read back over weeks and months, formed a kind of quiet poetry entirely by accident, a record of weather and ships and small deaths and long silences that no one but another keeper, or perhaps some future historian, would ever think to read with any real attention. But he wrote them anyway, faithfully, understanding that faithfulness was, in the end, the entire substance of the work. And it was in these hours of repetitive labor, the polishing, the hauling, the writing, the climbing, that he began to notice something in himself that he had not expected, a kind of drift that occurred beneath the surface of his attention, even as his hands continued their tasks without error. The mind, he found, did not need to be present for the body to do its work well. Indeed, the body seemed to prefer it, moving through the motions of cleaning and climbing and record-keeping with an ease that came only once thought had been set aside. He would find himself polishing a pane of glass with long, even strokes, while his mind wandered to his childhood home, or to the face of someone he had known years before, or to nothing at all, no image or memory, simply a kind of open stillness that had no name he knew. The monotony, which he had feared at first as a thing that might erode him, revealed itself instead to be something closer to a passage inward, a door that opened only after enough days had accumulated behind him, after the tasks had become so familiar that they no longer required the mind's full attention to be performed correctly. He began, without quite deciding to welcome these hours of drift, to recognize in them something almost restful, despite the physical labor that occasioned them, and he wondered, sometimes, whether this was what the older keepers had meant, when they spoke of the work becoming easier, not because it grew lighter, how to carry it, and yet the weather did not care what a man had learned to carry. It came regardless of readiness, regardless of the calm accumulation of days that had taught him to move through the tower's routines without thought. And when it came, it reminded him, quickly and without ceremony, that the sea's patience was not the same as its mercy. The autumn brought the first true test of this, a wind that arrived, not gradually, but all at once, as though some door far out over the water had been flung open, and within an hour the glass of the lantern room was streaked with spray thrown up from waves that should not, by any reasonable measure, have reached so high. He had been warned of this. The older keepers who trained him had spoken of storms that seemed to rise from the water itself rather than descend from the sky, storms in which the boundary between sea and air dissolved entirely, so that a man standing at the gallery rail could no longer say with certainty which element he stood within. Now he understood what they had meant, not as description but as memory, something lodged now in his own body, rather than merely heard from another's mouth. The storms that mattered most were not the sudden squalls that passed within hours, leaving the keeper shaken but intact, his supplies unspoiled and his resolve merely tested rather than broken. It was the sustained weather, the systems that settled over a station for days at a stretch, that wore at a man in ways no single violent night could manage. A gale that lasted 6 hours could be endured through simple stubbornness. through gritted teeth, and the knowledge that dawn would eventually come, and with it some relief. But a storm that lingered for a week, that kept the supply boat pinned to harbour, and the keeper's larder shrinking by careful calculation each morning, asked something different of him. It asked patience stretched thin, asked a kind of faith that the weather would break before the flour ran out, before the oil for the lamp grew too low to maintain the nightly burning that was, after all, the entire reason for his presence on that rock. Winters brought their own particular cruelty, a cold that worked its way into the tower's stone and seemed to live there, radiating outward from the walls even when the small stove in the keeper's quarters was fed continuously through the night. Ice formed on the inside of the lantern room glass some mornings, a thin sheet that had to be carefully scraped away before the day's cleaning could begin, and the keeper's hands grew accustomed to a particular ache that came not from any single injury but from the cumulative effect of cold water and cold metal and cold air. An ache that settled into the joints and stayed there through the brief southern months when the ice receded, but the memory of it did not. Some winters brought weeks during which no boat could safely approach the station at all, when the sea between the rock and the mainland churned with a violence that made any crossing a foolish gamble, and the keeper understood during these weeks what it meant to be entirely alone with only the light and his own thoughts for company. It was during these long isolations that a man learned things about himself he might otherwise never have discovered, some of them steadying, some of them less so. He learned how to ration not merely his food but his thoughts, how to parcel out his memories of home and family so that he did not exhaust them too quickly, did not spend all his comfort in the first days of isolation, only to find himself empty of it by the fourth or fifth week. He learned to write letters he could not send, addressing them to his wife or his mother or an old friend from the mainland, filling pages with observations about the weather and the birds and the small dramas of the tower's daily maintenance. Sealing these letters and setting them aside in a drawer, not because he expected they would ever be delivered in that form, but because the act of writing them was itself a kind of conversation, a way of keeping some part of himself in dialogue with the world, beyond the rock even when that world could not answer. When the boat finally came, weeks later, he would sometimes send these letters as they were dated and layered like sediment, a record of thoughts accumulated during a silence that the recipient could never fully understand from the outside. The rationing extended to food in ways that required a particular discipline, a mental arithmetic performed daily against the uncertain date of the next resupply. A keeper learned to look at his stores of flour and salt pork and tea and calculate not what he wanted to eat, but what he could afford to eat if the storm outside continued for another week beyond what seemed reasonable, because storms had a way of continuing beyond what seemed reasonable, of testing the outer edge of a man's calculations and sometimes exceeding them. There were stations in the historical record where keepers were found by the relief boat, thin and hollow-eyed, having stretched 3 weeks of food across 5 weeks of isolation, having eaten the last of their supplies with careful economy, a spoonful of oats here, a strip of dried meat there, enough to keep the body functioning, but not enough to keep hunger from becoming a low, constant hum beneath every other thought. Among the storms that history remembers with particular weight was the great gale that struck the Eddystone Light in the years before it achieved its final, more durable form. Storm so violent that it tested not merely the keeper's endurance, but the very structure meant to shelter him. The tower shook, by later accounts, in ways that no stone structure should shake, and the keeper within, cut off from any possibility of rescue, could do nothing but continue his duties as the wind screamed around him and waves broke against the base of the tower with a force that sent tremors up through the floor beneath his feet. He kept the light burning. This was, in the end, the entirety of his task and the entirety of his achievement, and it was enough, though the toll it took on his nerves and his sleep in the weeks that followed was never fully recorded, only implied in the brief, understated language of official reports that noted simply that the keeper had endured and that the light had not failed. Other storms left more permanent marks. There were towers where the lantern room glass was shattered by the sheer force of wind-driven water, where the keeper spent the worst hours of a gale huddled with whatever fabric he could find, stuffed into the broken panes, trying to shield the flame from a wind that seemed determined to extinguish it entirely. Understanding that if the light failed, even for a single night, some ship, somewhere, might pay for that failure with the lives of everyone aboard. This knowledge, more than any regulation or salary, was what kept keepers at their posts through weather that would have sent any reasonable man seeking shelter elsewhere. There was no elsewhere. The tower was shelter and duty simultaneously, and a keeper learned to hold both truths at once, to protect himself as best he could, while never forgetting that his own comfort was secondary to the beam that swept out across the black water, searching for ships he would never see, warning men whose names he would never know. The isolation, though, was not without its gifts, and it would be a disservice to the memory of these men to describe only the hardship without acknowledging the strange, quiet peace that also lived within those weeks of solitude. There were mornings when the storm had passed and the sea lay flat and silver beneath a sky, scrubbed clean of cloud, when the keeper stood at the gallery rail and felt something that could only be called gratitude. A sense that he had been given access to a version of the world that few others would ever witness. Du Plang, a stillness so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the small sounds of the tower settling around him, could feel himself, for a moment, entirely and simply alive in a way that seemed impossible amid the noise and clutter of ordinary life on the mainland. Solitude, he learned, was not a single thing, but two things intertwined. Peace and loneliness woven so closely together that a man could not always tell which thread he was following at any given moment. The loneliness crept in, usually not during the storms themselves, when the demands of the work left little room for reflection, but in the quiet aftermath, in the long evenings when the light was burning steadily and there was nothing left to do but sit with his own thoughts. It was then that a man might find himself listening for voices that were not there, might catch himself speaking aloud to no one simply to hear a human voice. Even his own, might feel the particular ache of missing a wife's laugh or a child's footsteps on a staircase, sounds so ordinary on the mainland that no one thought to treasure them. Sounds that became, on the rock, almost unbearably precious in their absence. And yet this same silence on other nights felt like a kind of mercy, a relief from the constant noise and obligation of the world he had left behind, a space in which he could simply exist without performance, without the need to explain himself to anyone, accountable only to the light and the sea and the slow turn of the hours. He came, over time, to hold both truths without needing to resolve them, to accept that a life given over to this work would always contain this doubled quality, this movement between contentment and ache that mirrored in its way the movement of the light itself, dark and bright, each state necessary to the meaning of the other. Neither complete without the presence of what it was not. Not every keeper lived alone with only the light and his thoughts for company. Many stations, especially those on the mainland or on islands large enough to sustain a household, were homes in the fullest sense, places where wives raised children within sight of the lantern room, where the ordinary business of family life unfolded against a backdrop of cliffs and tide and the ceaseless turning of the beam overhead. For these families, the lighthouse was not a post to be endured, but a residence to be inhabited, and the rhythms of domestic life bent themselves around the demands of the light the way a tree bends around a persistent wind, not broken by the pressure, but shaped by it, permanently, into a form that would not have existed under any gentler circumstance. A keeper's wife, in such a household carried a burden that history has often left unrecorded, though it was no less demanding than her husband's watch. She managed a home that could not simply close its doors against the weather, that had no neighbor to call upon in emergency, no shop to visit when supplies ran short before the relief boat's next arrival. She learned to stretch flour and salt pork across weeks longer than intended, to treat illness with what remedies she carried in a wooden chest, to deliver, in some remembered cases, her own children with no doctor nearer than a day's rough crossing away. She often stood watches herself, particularly in the smaller stations where only one keeper was assigned and his wife became by necessity and without official title a second keeper in all but name and pay. When her husband fell ill or exhaustion overtook him during a long storm, it was she who climbed the tower stairs in the black hours, who trimmed the wick and checked the mechanism and kept the light burning so that ships far out on the water would never know that the hands tending their safety had changed. The children born and raised in these towers grew up inside a childhood, unlike almost any other one, measured out in tides and weather rather than in the seasons of school terms and neighborhood friendships that shaped the lives of children elsewhere. Formal schooling arrived to them by correspondence, when it arrived at all, lessons mailed out from distant education boards, arithmetic problems, and reading primers that a mother would work through with her children at the kitchen table while the wind pressed against the windows and the lamp burned steadily above them. Some families managed remarkably well under this arrangement, producing children who read early and widely, who developed a precision with numbers born of practical necessity, calculating tides and fuel consumption, and the mathematics of provisioning long before they might have encountered such problems in any ordinary classroom. Others struggled, isolated from the corrective presence of trained teachers, and keepers' children sometimes arrived at whatever brief schooling they eventually received on the mainland, already behind their peers in some respects, and strangely unaccountably ahead in others, fluent in the names of cloud formations and the behavior of currents in ways that baffled instructors who had never needed such knowledge themselves. What these children lacked in classroom instruction, they gained in an education the sea itself provided, one no institution could have replicated. They learned to read weather the way other children learned to read books, understanding long before they could have articulated the principles behind it that a particular greenish cast to the sky meant one kind of storm and a certain quality of stillness before wind. That gulls flying low and inland was saying something about the barometer that no instrument in the lighthouse could say more plainly. They played among rocks and tide pools with a familiarity that came from years of unsupervised exploration, learning which pools held crabs and which held only smaller lives, which rocks turned slick with a particular kind of algae in a way that made them dangerous to climb, which stretches of shore disappeared entirely at certain tides and which remained passable even at the water's fullest reach. They developed, in short, a bodily knowledge of their environment that town-raised children of the same era rarely possessed, an intimacy with a specific patch of coastline that came from having no other patch of ground to know. This upbringing carried genuine hardship alongside its unusual riches. There were no other children, in many cases for months or years at a stretch, no playmates beyond siblings, and no experience of the ordinary friendships and rivalries that shape most childhoods. Medical emergencies carried a weight of dread that inland families rarely had to face, since a child's sudden fever or broken bone could not be addressed by a quick trip to a doctor's office, but required, instead, the raising of a signal flag and the long, uncertain wait for a boat that might not be able to cross in bad weather even after it had been summoned. Loneliness settled over some of these families in ways that let us home when they could be sent and received only partially relieved. And yet within this isolation and hardship, families found and made a life that was not simply endurance, but, in its own particular way, something approaching contentment, even joy. Meals shared around a table in a keeper's cottage carried a significance that perhaps only isolation could confer, the gathering of the whole small household at day's end, or between watches becoming an anchor point around which the rest of the day's labor organized itself. A mother's cooking, however limited by what supplies the last boat had brought, took on an importance beyond mere sustenance, becoming one of the few sensory pleasures available in an environment otherwise dominated by salt and stone and the metallic smell of the lamp's oil. Keepers and their families sang in many recorded accounts, songs passed down from the regions they had come from, hymns and old ballads carried out to these remote stations in memory rather than in any book, sung sometimes deliberately against the sound of the wind, as if the human voice, however small, might answer the storm's vastness with something equally persistent, if considerably gentler. Children learned these songs before they learned much else, absorbing them the way children anywhere absorb the sounds of their household, and carried them in later years back into the wider world as a kind of inheritance from towers that no longer stood or no longer held keepers. Small gardens grew, against considerable odds, in salt-worn soil that seemed to promise nothing but failure. Keepers built raised beds where they could, hauled in soil from the mainland, in sacks when the native ground proved too thin or too poisoned by salt spray to sustain anything, and coaxed hardy vegetables and sometimes flowers from these unlikely plots with a patience that mirrored the patience their work already demanded of them. A row of cabbages or potatoes represented not merely food, though the food mattered enormously in stations where supply boats came rarely, but also a small victory over an environment that seemed built to resist exactly this kind of domestic softness. A handful of flowers grown successfully against a lighthouse wall became, in more than one memoir, written by a keeper's child decades later, one of the most vivid memories of the entire childhood, more vivid even than the storms, because it represented color and growth, persisting in a place that offered so little of either without human effort. Among the families whose accounts have survived to illustrate this life, the story of the Willises, who kept a light on a rocky station off a wind-swept coast for the better part of 2 decades, offers a particularly full picture of what such an existence could hold. The keeper, a quiet and exacting man by his own children's later description, arrived at the station in early adulthood, already married, and he and his wife raised 4 children there across the years that followed, sending them, the last of them, off to mainland relatives for proper schooling only when the eldest had reached an age where correspondence lessons no longer served. The Willis children later described, in interviews and brief written recollections gathered by a regional historical society, a childhood that mixed genuine deprivation with an abundance of a different kind, remembering the terror of watching their mother stand alone on the gallery during a night storm when their father lay fevered and unable to climb, but remembering with equal clarity the pleasure of a particular Christmas when a supply boat, delayed for weeks by weather, arrived at last, carrying not just flour and oil, but a small parcel of oranges, a fruit so rare in that household that the children spoke of the smell of them decades afterward. They remembered their mother's garden, a stubborn square of turned earth behind the keeper's cottage that produced most years a respectable crop of potatoes and a few defiant marigolds that she tended as though they were the most important plants in the world, because in that place, for that family, they very nearly were. They remembered singing on the gallery in calm weather, their father's uncertain baritone carrying old hymns out over water that gave no indication it was listening. And they remembered, too, the particular quality of pride that came from being trusted, even as children, with responsibilities that mainland children of the same age would never have been given, tasks connected to the light's maintenance that made them feel, correctly, that their small hands mattered to something larger than themselves. This was the double inheritance of a childhood spent in the tower's shadow, hardship and richness woven together so tightly that neither could be extracted from the other without diminishing the whole. And it was a life that, however strange it appeared from the outside, produced in those who lived it a particular kind of loyalty to the sea and to the discipline of watching that would follow many of them, in one form or another, for the rest of their lives. But if the tower shaped the lives of those who tended it, its true purpose lay elsewhere, out past the reach of any window, in the wheelhouses and forecastles of vessels the keeper would never see clearly and whose crews would never learn his name. The light existed for them. Every trimmed wick, every polished lens, every log entry recording the hour of lighting and the hour of extinguishing was made in service of men and women whose faces would remain forever unknown to the keeper, whose voices would never be heard, whose gratitude, if it came at all, would arrive only as a shape glimpsed briefly against the horizon before the sea carried it away. This was among the loneliest aspects of the calling, and also among its most quietly noble, for the keeper labored not for recognition but for the simple, unprovable fact that somewhere beyond the reach of the beam, a ship was finding its way because of a light he had lit with his own hands. The relationship between the keeper and the sailor was almost entirely one of inference. From the tower, the keeper could not know which vessels had altered course because of the light, which captains had corrected a bearing at the sight of the flash, which helmsmen had breathed easier upon confirming their position against the rhythm of the beam. All of this happened at a distance the eye could not resolve into detail. A ship was a smudge of shadow against darker water, a set of running lights moving with slow deliberation along the edge of visibility. And then, if all went well, it was gone, absorbed back into the night without incident. Its passage through the dangerous waters near the tower reduced to nothing more than a line in a log that no one but the keeper would ever read. Success, in this work, looked like absence. It looked like silence. It looked like nothing happening at all, which was precisely the point, and which made the labor of lighthouse keeping perhaps the only occupation whose greatest triumphs were, by their very nature, invisible. And yet the keepers came to understand, over years of watching, that this invisibility was not emptiness. It was, instead, a kind of communion conducted entirely through light. When the beam swept out across the water and a ship's lookout caught its flash and called the bearing down to the wheelhouse, something passed between the tower and the vessel that neither party could name but both could feel, a recognition that another human being, awake in the darkness, was maintaining a small fire against the vastness of the sea for their benefit alone. The sailor did not know the keeper's name, did not know if he was young or old, married or solitary, content or weary of his post. And the keeper did not know the sailor's name, either could not know how many souls were aboard the ship, whose lights he glimpsed sliding past the point, could not know if the vessel carried grain or timber, or immigrants bound for a new life, or fishermen returning home with the week's catch weighing heavy in the hold. All of this remained unknown, and yet the connection between them, however abstract, was real, forged in the simple fact that one was watching so the other could safely pass. Some keepers described it, in later years, as the closest thing to prayer they ever practiced. Not because it invoked any particular faith, but because it required a similar suspension of certainty, a similar trust that the effort mattered, even when no proof of its mattering would ever arrive. The near misses were the moments when this invisible bond became, briefly, almost tangible. A keeper standing watch through a fog so dense that the light itself seemed to dissolve within a few yards of the lens might hear, carried faintly across the water, the sound of a ship's engines slowing, then reversing, then falling silent, as the vessel held its position, rather than risk the shoals it could sense, but not see. In such moments the keeper understood, without any confirmation beyond the sound itself, that the fog signal had done its work, that somewhere out in that grey nothing, a captain had heard the horn's low moan and made the decision to wait rather than proceed, and that this single choice, made by a stranger the keeper would never meet, had likely preserved lives that would go on, unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. There was no ceremony attached to such moments. The keeper simply noted the time in the log, recorded the conditions, and returned to his watch, carrying with him a private knowledge that something significant had occurred and passed without incident, without drama, without anyone beyond himself even aware that a crisis had been narrowly, silently avoided. Other nights offered no such ambiguity. Along one particularly notorious stretch of coast, where a chain of submerged rocks extended nearly a mile beyond the visible shoreline, the keeper stationed there through the middle years of the light's operation kept a private accounting, separate from the official log, of vessels he believed the light had saved. It was not a scientific record. He could not prove causation in any single case. But he noted over the decades certain nights when a ship's lights appeared on a heading that would have driven it directly onto the rocks, only to correct sharply moments after the beam swept across its bow, the vessel altering course with the abruptness of a captain who has just realized, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly where he stands in relation to disaster. On one such night, remembered by the keeper's family long after his death and eventually recorded in a regional maritime history, a coastal steamer running behind schedule and pressing hard through worsening weather came within what witnesses aboard later estimated to be less than a quarter-mile of the rocks before the light's beam. Duck-tutting briefly through a gap in the weather revealed the danger in time for the helmsman to bring the wheel hard over. The ship's own log, examined years later by a maritime historian researching the region's wrecks, contained a terse entry noting the near disaster and crediting the light with what the entry's author, evidently still shaken by the memory, called their deliverance from the rocks that would surely have opened the hull. This single incident, preserved almost by accident in a shipping company's archive, became for later generations a kind of proof of the value of a labor that otherwise left so little evidence of itself. Historians researching the tower's history seized upon it as confirmation of what the keepers themselves had always believed, but could rarely demonstrate, that the long hours of vigilance, the careful maintenance, the discipline of lighting the lamp at precisely the correct moment each evening, all of it amounted to something real and measurable, even if the measurement in this case took the form of a ship's log entry rather than any official commendation. The keeper on duty that night, whose name appears in the historical record only because a later archivist thought to cross-reference the shipping company's files with the Lighthouse's own logs, received no medal, no public recognition, no letter of thanks from the grateful captain. He simply noted the weather, the visibility, and the hour, and continued his watch, unaware for the rest of his career that his light had, on that particular night, prevented what would very likely have been a significant loss of life. It was this asymmetry, this profound imbalance between the weight of what the keeper's labor accomplished and the thinness of the acknowledgement it typically received, that came to define the emotional texture of the profession for those who practiced it across the years. The keepers did not resent this imbalance, or if they did, they rarely recorded such resentment in writing. But they were aware of it, aware that theirs was a service rendered almost entirely on faith, sustained by the belief that the ships passing safely in the darkness represented real lives spared rather than a fortunate absence of incident that would have occurred with or without the light's assistance. This belief required a particular kind of temperament, one willing to find meaning in labor whose success was defined by nothing happening, one capable of drawing satisfaction from silence rather than celebration. And it was perhaps this temperament, more than any technical skill, that separated those who thrived in the keeping of lights from those who found the isolation and the invisibility of the work unbearable. For the sailors themselves, the light occupied a different but equally significant place in the imagination. To crews working coastal routes over years or decades, certain lighthouses became almost personified, spoken of by name and by character in the way a difficult but respected colleague might be discussed. This one known for its particular flash pattern. That one remembered for the way its beams seemed to hold steady, even through weather that extinguished other lights along the same stretch of water. Sailors passing a familiar tower at night sometimes offered it a kind of silent acknowledgement, a private ritual known only to themselves, a moment of recognition extended toward the unseen keeper whose vigilance had, over years of passage, become as reliable and as taken for granted as the stars themselves. And though the keeper could not see this acknowledgement, could not know that his light had earned, among strangers passing in the dark, a form of respect approaching affection, the sailors carried this feeling with them from voyage to voyage, passing it down to younger crew members who learned in turn to watch for the same flash and to trust it in the same way. Until the light itself became a kind of inherited relationship, passed between generations of sailors who would never meet the keeper, but who understood in some unspoken way. That his presence in the tower made their passage through dangerous water a little less perilous than it would otherwise have been. And yet for all this trust, for all the quiet faith that sailors placed in the discipline of men they had never met, there were nights when the light did not come, when the tower stood dark against a sky already dark, and the sea beyond it moved without any answering flash to mark where the rocks began and the safe water ended. These nights were rare, kept rare by the very devotion that made lighthouse keeping a vocation rather than a mere occupation, but they occurred, scattered through the long record of the service like small silences in an otherwise steady rhythm, and each one carried its own weight of consequence, its own quiet accounting of what a lapsed light could cost a ship that had trusted it to be there. One such night belongs to a station on a low, exposed headland, where the keeper, a man well into his 5th decade of service, had begun in recent months to notice a persistent ache behind his eyes, a heaviness that came upon him in the late afternoons and did not lift until he had slept, sometimes not even then. He mentioned this to no one. There was no assistant at his station that season, his usual companion having been reassigned inland for reasons of family illness, and so the keeper stood his watches alone, climbing the tower each evening with the same unhurried care he had shown for 30 years, trimming his wick, polishing his glass, winding the great weight that turned the lens through its slow revolutions. He did not think of himself as unwell. He thought of himself as tired, and tiredness was a condition he had learned to work through, as all keepers learned, treating fatigue as weather to be endured rather than illness to be reported. The lens itself had also begun, in this same season, to show a hairline flaw near its lower edge, a crack so fine it had escaped notice during the keeper's daily inspections, catching the light only at certain angles, invisible in the direct glare of the flame, but faintly present when the sun struck the glass from the side in early morning. Such flaws were not uncommon in lenses that had served for decades, the glass having been ground and set long before the keeper himself had arrived at the station, and the flaw alone would not have been enough to darken the light. Cracked lenses had carried beams across many miles of water for years before eventually being replaced, their imperfections compensated for by the strength of the flame behind them. But the flaw, combined with the keeper's failing attention, combined further with a night of unusual weather, created together a set of circumstances that no single failure could have produced alone. The evening in question began, as so many did, with fog rolling in from the water in the last hour before sunset, thick enough to blur the line between sea and sky, but not yet dense enough to trouble a keeper accustomed to worse. He climbed the tower at his usual hour, later than intended by perhaps 20 minutes, a delay he would later have been unable to explain, except to say that his legs had felt unusually heavy on the stairs, that he had paused twice to rest against the cold stone of the tower wall, breathing carefully, waiting for a tightness in his chest to ease before continuing upward. He lit the lamp at last, though his hands were unsteady in a way they had not been unsteady before, and he watched the flame catch and settle into its usual glow, and he believed, in the fog-dimmed evening light, that all was as it should be. What he did not see, what perhaps no one could have seen without close and deliberate inspection, was that the flame had caught unevenly, that a slight misalignment in the wick itself, perhaps the result of hands that trembled more than the keeper wished to admit, had thrown the light through the cracked portion of the lens at an angle that scattered rather than focused it, sending out not the clean, far-reaching beam that ships depended upon, but a softer, more diffuse glow, one that would have been visible only at a fraction of the light's usual range. The keeper, his vision troubled by the same illness that made his hands unsteady, his head aching now with a pain sharper than any he had known, did not notice the change. He made his way back down the stairs to rest as he always did between his hourly checks, and he lay upon his narrow bed with the intention of resting only briefly. And there, in the fog-muffled quiet of his small room at the base of the tower, he lost consciousness in a manner from which he would not fully recover until the following afternoon. The hours that followed have been reconstructed since through testimony taken from surviving crew and from an inquiry conducted by the Maritime Authority responsible for the coast. And though no account can restore what was lost that night, the record allows a patient telling of what likely occurred. A merchant vessel, inbound from the north and running later than her captain had intended, approached the headland in the deepening fog with the expectation, entirely reasonable, entirely earned by years of the light's faithful service, that the beam would appear at the expected interval. Sweeping its warning across the water in the rhythm the captain had long since committed to memory. The light did appear, faint and diffuse where it should have been sharp, visible only when the ship had already drawn far closer to the rocks than her captain believed her to be, the fog compounding the deception, allowing him to read the pale glow as a light still many miles distant. By the time the lookout called a warning, by the time the captain understood the water beneath his hull to be shallower than his charts allowed for at this distance from the tower, there was no longer sea room enough to correct the course. The vessel struck the rocks with a sound that those aboard would later describe, in testimony given weeks afterward, as almost gentle at first, a grinding shudder rather than a violent impact, though the gentleness of the beginning gave way within minutes to the harder truth of a hull opening to the sea. The crew took to what boats could be launched in the fog and the confused water, and most reached shore alive, guided in the end not by any light, but by the sound of breakers against the headland itself, a cruel irony that the very rocks which had wrecked them became in the darkness their only means of finding land. 3 men did not survive the crossing from ship to shore. Bodies were recovered in the days that followed, laid to rest in the small churchyard nearest the station. Their names entered into a register that the keeper himself, once his illness had passed and his strength had partially returned, was asked to help complete. An obligation he fulfilled with a steadiness that those who witnessed it found more sorrowful than if he had wept. The subsequent inquiry did not find fault with the keeper in the manner that might be expected, or at least not fault of the kind that could be punished. The physicians who examined him determined that he had suffered what they termed an apoplectic episode, a sudden failure of the body's function brought on likely by exhaustion, by months of solitary duty performed without adequate rest, by the accumulated weight of a service that had asked of him for 3 decades. A vigilance that allowed for no acknowledged illness, no admitted weakness, no rest beyond what could be stolen in the brief intervals between one duty and the next. The lens was replaced. The keeper, his health only partially restored, was permitted to retire from the service with what pension the authority could provide, and he lived out his remaining years in a small house within sight of the tower he had tended, watching, it was said, its light each evening from his window, though he never again climbed the stairs to stand beside it. The community that had grown up around the fishing grounds near that headland absorbed the loss of the 3 drowned men in the manner such communities absorbed all losses to the sea, with a grief that did not announce itself loudly but settled instead into the rhythms of daily life, into the empty places at tables, into the boats that went out with fewer hands than before. No one blamed the keeper, not openly, not in the words spoken aloud in the small church where the men were buried, though it is likely that some private accounting was made in the quiet of individual hearts, some private wondering about what might have been different had an assistant been posted to that station. Had the keeper reported his failing health before it failed him entirely? Had the flaw in the lens been discovered a season earlier? These were not questions that could be answered, and the community, in its way, chose not to ask them too insistently, understanding perhaps that the sea's dangers could never be entirely eliminated by human vigilance, however faithful, and that the failure of a single light on a single night after decades of faithful service was itself a kind of evidence for how rarely such lights failed, how much weight had been carried, night after night, by keepers whose names were never recorded in any registry of maritime disaster, whose successes were measured only in the ships that passed safely and were never heard from again in any official record. Their safe arrival itself, a kind of silence, a story that never needed telling because nothing had gone wrong. There was one story, though, that the keepers themselves rarely spoke of aloud, and when they did, they lowered their voices as though the telling might draw the attention of something better left undisturbed. It concerned a station far out in the Atlantic, on a cluster of rocks so remote and so exposed that the men who built its tower had needed nearly 4 years to complete what elsewhere might have taken 1, hauling stone and iron up cliffs that offered no natural harbor, no gentle slope, nothing but sheer walls rising from water that seemed, even on calm days, to remember every ship it had ever taken. Warp, Harper, The islands were small, uninhabited, but for the tower, swept by weather that could change in the space of an afternoon from stillness to fury. And it was here, in December of a year that would otherwise have passed unremarked in the long history of the light, that 3 keepers vanished without leaving behind any trace of what had happened to them. Any struggle, any explanation, anything at all except a station left in a condition so orderly, so undisturbed, that the mystery of their absence became, in time, one of the most enduring in the history of the sea. The disappearance was not discovered quickly because the nature of remote stations was that weeks could pass without contact. The keepers, sustained by supplies laid in months in advance, their isolation a condition of the posting rather than an emergency in itself. It was a passing steamer that first noticed the light was dark on a December night when it should have been burning, and the observation was passed along the chain of maritime reporting with the same unhurried procedure that governed all such matters. A note made, a relief vessel eventually dispatched, no one yet alarmed. Because lights failed, for ordinary reasons, more often than not, and there was no reason to assume this instance was anything other than a mechanical fault or a delay in the keeper's routine. The relief vessel, when it finally arrived some days later, found no flag raised to greet it, no keeper waiting on the landing to help secure the lines, none of the customary signals that marked a station where men were present and well. The silence, even before the boat made shore, was itself a kind of message, and the men aboard felt it, the particular quality of a place that has gone quiet in a way that ordinary quiet does not resemble. What they found, once they had climbed the steps and entered the tower, was a station that appeared, in almost every particular, exactly as it should have. The light apparatus was clean and in order, though unlit. The logbook had been kept faithfully up to a certain date, the entries in the familiar hand of the head keeper, describing weather that had grown severe, wind rising, sea state worsening, nothing in the language of the entries suggesting panic or foreboding, only the routine notation of a storm that, judging by the entries, one of the keepers had found troubling enough to record with more than usual care. And then the entry stopped. There was no final note of alarm, no unfinished sentence trailing into blankness, no indication that the writer had been interrupted in the act of writing. The log simply ended as though the next entry had never come due and would not. The scene inside the living quarters deepened rather than resolved the mystery. A meal appeared to have been left partway through, though accounts of exactly what was found varied in the retelling over the years that followed, some describing an overturned chair as though someone had risen suddenly, others insisting the room was entirely composed, nothing knocked aside, nothing broken. Quote, "The ordinary evidence of men who had simply stepped out and not returned. The clock had stopped, though whether from neglect of winding or some more unsettling cause was never established. Oilskins belonging to one of the keepers were missing from their hook, suggesting that at least one man had gone out into weather deliberately, dressed for it, perhaps to check on equipment or secure something battered loose by the storm, while the oilskins of the other two remained in place, as though they had followed in haste, without pausing to dress for conditions they perhaps did not expect to face directly. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage of a boat, no fragment of clothing caught on the rocks, no trace at all beyond the ordinary wear of the island itself, which offered no clue as to what had become of the three men who had, weeks before, been going about their duties with the same unremarkable diligence as every other night of their service. The investigation that followed was conducted with the seriousness such a disappearance demanded, officials examining the tower, the landing stages, the equipment, searching for anything that might explain how three trained men, familiar with the dangers of their posting, could vanish so completely and so silently. What they found, or rather did not find, only deepened the puzzle. The landing area where supplies were normally winched up from the sea showed signs of damage consistent with extremely heavy weather. A mounted crane, bent, ropes torn away, boxes of supplies displaced from where they should have been secured. Evidence that a wave or series of waves of unusual violence had struck the landing at some point during the storm the log had described. This became, in time, the theory favored by most who studied the case seriously, that the keepers, concerned for the safety of equipment or supplies at the landing, had gone down to secure what they could and had been caught by a wave far larger than anything the exposed platform was built to withstand, a wave that could sweep three men from the rocks without leaving any trace, the sea closing over them as completely and silently as it closed over anything it chose to take. It was, on reflection, not an implausible explanation. The waters around such stations were known for producing swells of tremendous and sometimes freakish size, rogue movements of water that arrived without the warning a trained eye might otherwise read in the sea's ordinary behavior, and there was precedent enough, in the long history of coastal disaster, for men to be lost this way. Taken suddenly from rocks they had stood upon safely 1,000 times before. And yet the theory, however sound, left certain details unaccounted for, particularly the oilskins left behind, the meal apparently interrupted, the sense that whatever had happened with a suddenness that gave the men no time even to reach for the clothing meant to protect them from exactly the conditions the theory proposed. It was possible, of course, that haste alone explained the oversight, that a man rushing toward danger might forget the coat hanging by the door, but the detail lingered in the retelling of the story for generations afterward, a small crack through which speculation of every kind was able to enter. And enter it did. In the absence of certainty, the story acquired, over the decades, a mythology of its own, theories multiplying in proportion to the silence that surrounded the facts. Some spoke of foreign vessels, of foul play, of a dispute among the keepers themselves that had ended in violence, though nothing in the physical evidence supported such a reading. No sign of struggle, no blood, nothing but the orderly emptiness that made every violent theory seem on reflection less likely than the plain unglamorous possibility of the sea. Others reached further into folklore, suggesting that the island itself was cursed, that men had disappeared from its shores before the tower was ever built, that the light had been erected on ground the local fishermen had long avoided for reasons they could not entirely articulate, only that something about the place had never felt right, and that the keepers had fallen victim to a danger the maps and charts could not record. These stories, whatever their truth, spoke less to the specifics of the case than to the deeper unease the mystery provoked in all who heard it, the sense that a place built and staffed entirely for the purpose of guiding others safely could itself become the site of a disappearance so complete that not even the disappearance could be fully explained. What remained, after the investigators had done what investigation could do, was not a solution but a range of possibilities. Weighted by evidence but never confirmed by it, the rogue wave the most probable, the mystery nonetheless permanent, because probability is not proof, and the sea offers no confession. The families of the three men were left with the same uncertainty that had settled over the tower itself, a grief without the shape that even tragic certainty provides. No grave, no final understanding of the moment their husbands and fathers and sons had left the world, only the knowledge that they had gone out in the ordinary way, to do the ordinary work of the light, and had not returned. The station was restored, eventually relit, staffed by new keepers who lived and worked in the same rooms, tended the same apparatus, walked the same narrow paths to the same landing where the sea still rose, on stormy nights, in swells that gave no particular indication of malice, only of scale, only of a force that had never once, plank, in all the ages before the tower was built, or after it was abandoned, felt any obligation to explain itself to the men who lived in its shadow. The story endured, retold in maritime histories and in the quieter conversations of keepers at other stations, not because it had been solved, but precisely because it had not. Because the sea, unlike almost everything else that intersected with the ordered record-keeping of the Lighthouse service, declined to leave an entry in the log, declined to offer even the courtesy of an ending, and left instead a silence that outlasted every theory built to fill it. A silence that the following generations of keepers carried with them quietly, into every storm that rose without warning against the rocks where they stood their watch. The change did not arrive as storms arrived, sudden and declared, but crept forward the way tide creeps across a flat shore, so slowly that a keeper watching the water might not notice the difference from 1 hour to the next, and yet, returning after some years away, would find the whole shape of the coastline altered beyond recognition. It began, as such, things often do, with wires. Electricity found its way to the lonely towers first, as a convenience, a replacement for the oil lamps that had to be filled and trimmed and watched through the night, a way of making the light burn brighter and longer, with less labor from the men who tended it. The keepers who welcomed this change did not yet understand that they were welcoming their own obsolescence, for a light that could burn itself, that required no wick trimmed at 3 in the morning, no reservoir refilled before dawn, was a light one step closer to needing no one at all. Then came the mechanisms that could turn a light on and off by themselves, sensing the failing of daylight and the return of dawn without a human hand to throw the switch. And after that, the mechanisms that could rotate the lens without a keeper winding the clockwork weights. And after that, the mechanisms that could sound a fog signal when moisture in the air reached a certain measure, all of it arriving gradually, station by station, decade by decade, so that a keeper at one lighthouse might read in a service bulletin of a colleague's post being automated 100 miles up the coast and feel a small chill of recognition, the way one feels upon hearing of an illness in a person of similar age and constitution to oneself. Understanding that the news, though not yet personal, was no longer merely abstract, the lighthouse services of the world's maritime nations approached the matter with the particular carefulness bureaucracies reserve for changes they know will be received with sorrow, issuing reports on efficiency and cost, on the reliability of the new equipment, on the savings to be found in removing salaries and provisions and transport from the ledger. And always, somewhere in these reports, a brief acknowledgement, almost apologetic in tone, that something intangible would be lost even as something practical was gained. The engineers who designed the automated systems were not unfeeling men. Many of them had grown up in sight of a lighthouse, had perhaps known a keeper by name, had understood on some level that they were not merely improving a piece of maritime infrastructure, but ending a way of life that had persisted with remarkably little alteration since the first fires were lit on headlands by people whose names no history remembers. But engineering proceeds by its own logic, and the logic was clear. A machine did not need to be fed, did not need family visits, did not fall ill, did not grow old, did not require, in the end, anything but occasional maintenance from a technician who could arrive by boat or helicopter, perform the necessary repairs, and leave again before nightfall, never once needing to stay through the dark. The last keepers, the ones who held their posts into the era when automation had become not a distant rumor, but a scheduled certainty, lived through their final years of service with an awareness that colored everything, though few spoke of it directly. There was a particular quality to the way these final keepers tended their lights, a thoroughness that bordered on tenderness, as though they were caring not merely for a piece of equipment, but for something that deserved, in its last years of needing them, the fullest measure of their attention. Logbooks from this period where they survive show no diminishment in the carefulness of their entries, no slackening of the routines that had governed lighthouse life for generations. If anything, the entries grow more detailed, more descriptive, as though the keepers understood, without being told, that they were writing not only a record of weather and shipping, but an account of something ending, and that future readers might want more from these final pages than the terse notations of ordinary years. The decommissioning itself, when it came to each station in turn, was rarely dramatic. There was no single day when the age of the keeper ended, for the change unfolded lighthouse by lighthouse across many years, but the pattern was similar wherever it occurred. A date would be set, communicated well in advance, giving the keeper time to prepare for a departure unlike any other in a career spent measuring time by the turning of the light. Officials would arrive, sometimes with a small ceremony, sometimes with nothing more than paperwork and a handshake, to formally transfer the responsibility of the light from the human keeper to the automated system that would take his place. Photographs from these occasions, where they were taken, show men standing beside their towers with expressions difficult to name precisely, containing as they did both a visible pride in service completed and a grief too large and unfamiliar to display fully before witnesses. Many of these men had spent decades at a single station, had raised children within sight of the same rocks, had watched the same patch of sea change through every season of their working lives, and now found themselves handing over the care of that light to a machine that would perform the function, but not the vigil. For vigil requires a consciousness capable of caring whether the light continues to burn, and machines, however faithfully engineered, do not care about anything at all. Some keepers spoke in interviews conducted by local newspapers or maritime historians in the years that followed of the strange sensation of walking away from a lighthouse for the last time, knowing that the light would still shine that night and every night after without them. It was a peculiar kind of obsolescence, different from the ordinary retirement that comes to most working lives. For most retiring workers can at least believe that someone will step into their role, will inherit not only their duties but their watchfulness, their judgment, their capacity to notice when something is wrong. The departing keeper had no such successor. He was not training a replacement. He was performing in his final days a kind of dissolution of an entire category of human occupation, the last representative of a role that would not continue in any human form after he closed the door of the lighthouse behind him. What was lost in this transition, though difficult to quantify in the reports that justified it, was something the keepers themselves understood better than anyone. Particular quality of attention that only a person present and awake and invested in the outcome can bring to a task. A machine could turn a light on when darkness fell and off when dawn arrived, could rotate a lens on schedule, could sound a signal when fog thickened past a certain measure, but a machine could not notice the small irregularity in the sound of its own mechanism that suggested a bearing was wearing thin, that the weather approaching from the southwest carried something worse than the forecast suggested, could not feel the particular unease that had, more than once in the long history of lighthouse keeping, prompted a keeper to check a light an hour early and discover a failing lamp before it failed entirely. The automated systems were reliable in the way that mechanisms are reliable, performing their designed function until a component broke. And when a component did break, there was no one present to notice immediately, no one to climb the stairs at an odd hour because something felt wrong. Only the eventual report from a passing vessel or a routine inspection that the light had gone dark, sometimes for hours, sometimes for longer, before anyone on land became aware. And yet the automated lights, whatever they lacked in vigilance, did not fail so often as to make the change seem a mistake, for the engineering had been thorough and the redundancies well designed, and ships continued to find their way past the rocks and shoals that the lights had always marked. Guided now by a beam that no human eye watched from within the tower, but that shone nonetheless faithful in its mechanical way, through nights that had once required a person to stay awake through their entirety. In the present day, the towers that once housed keepers stand mostly empty of the life that filled them, though many have found new purposes that honor, in some measure, what they once were. Some have become museums, their keepers' quarters restored to approximate the conditions of a particular decade, allowing visitors to climb the same stairs a keeper once climbed and see arranged with careful attention to accuracy the furniture and instruments and daily objects of a life now vanished from the coastlines of the world. Others have become vacation lodgings, where travelers pay to spend a night in rooms once occupied by families who lived there year-round, though few of these visitors, drifting to sleep to the sound of waves against rocks, fully grasp what it meant to hear that sound not for a weekend, but for a lifetime. Not as a pleasant novelty, but as the entire audible world. The descendants of keepers, when interviewed by historians gathering the last living memories of this vanished profession, speak often of a particular pride mixed with a particular loss, describing childhoods spent in towers that no longer exist as inhabited spaces, and wondering sometimes aloud whether anyone still understands what was required to keep a light burning through 100 years of nights before switches and sensors made the keeping automatic. Their memories, gathered now into archives and oral history projects before the last of them are lost entirely, form perhaps the truest remaining record of what it meant to be a keeper, more intimate than any logbook, more honest than any official report, carrying forward into the present the quiet dignity of a labor that the sea in its indifference never once acknowledged, and that history, in its own way, is only now beginning to understand it very nearly forgot. The tower on the point still stands, though the man who first climbed its stairs in this telling has been gone now for the better part of a century. His name recorded on a small brass plaque that visitors sometimes pause to read before moving on to photograph the lens, the view, the long drop to the rocks below. The light itself no longer depends on him or on anyone like him. Somewhere in a control room many miles distant, a technician glances at a screen that tells her, among 100 other lights along the coast, that this one is burning as it should, its rhythm unbroken, its bulb rated to last years before it will need replacing by a maintenance crew who will visit perhaps twice in a decade, checking circuits, clearing the lens of salt and dust, and leaving again before nightfall. The keeper's house beside the tower has been repainted in the colors it wore when it was inhabited, though no one inhabits it now except, on certain weekends, a caretaker who leads tours through rooms furnished with reproductions of the furniture that once stood there: an iron bed, a wooden table, a stove no longer connected to any flue. Children walk through these rooms and are told in the patient voice of a docent who has explained it many times that a family once lived here, that a man and sometimes his wife and children spent years in this small space watching the sea, and the children listen with the particular attention that children give to stories that seem to them almost impossible to believe, that anyone would choose such a life, that anyone could bear such solitude. And the docent, who has thought about this longer than the children have been alive, does not try to explain that the keepers did not always experience it as a choice or a burden, but simply as a life. One day at a time, in the company of wind and water and a light that needed tending. The lens that once required a keeper's hands to wind its clockwork now turns on a small electric motor that draws less power in a night than the old oil lamps once burned in an hour. And this fact, when visitors learn it, tends to produce a kind of quiet in them, a recognition that something has been lost, even something else has been gained, that the efficiency of the modern light has purchased itself with the absence of the human presence that once made the tower a home rather than merely a mechanism. The automation did not happen all at once. It came slowly, station by station, over decades, as engineers found ways to make lights flash reliably without a hand to trim the wick, as radio beacons, and then satellite systems began to offer ships navigation that did not depend on a beam of light being visible at all. As the economics of maintaining a resident keeper at every station became harder to justify against the cost of a single technician overseeing dozens of automated towers from a desk far inland. Last keepers to leave their posts often did so with a mixture of relief and grief that they themselves struggled to reconcile, relief at the end of an isolation that had worn on them for years, grief at the end of a way of life that had given their days a shape and their labor a meaning that the world outside the tower rarely offered in such unambiguous terms. Some of them, in the interviews recorded before their deaths, spoke of visiting old stations after their automation, standing outside towers where they had once lived, and finding the light still turning, still doing the work they had once done with their own hands, though now without any need of them at all. And the strangeness of that, one keeper said, was harder to sit with than any storm had ever been. It is worth returning in these final moments to the shape of the labor itself and to what it asked of the people who performed it across the long century when human hands were required to keep a light burning through every night, regardless of weather, regardless of loneliness, regardless of the toll that isolation took on a mind left too long, lone with the sound of wind and water. The keeper's life was not dramatic in the way that history often prefers its subjects to be. There were no battles fought, no empires built, no speeches remembered. There was only the nightly climbing of stairs, the trimming of a wick, the winding of a mechanism, the recording of a weather observation in a logbook that would be read, if it was read at all, by an inspector passing through once or twice a year. And yet within that unglamorous repetition, lived a kind of duty that asked everything of a person and offered, in return, little beyond the quiet satisfaction of work done well and the knowledge rarely spoken aloud. That somewhere out on the dark water, a ship's crew was orienting itself by a light that would not have existed without the labor of maintaining it. This is a form of service that history struggles to commemorate, because it produces no single moment of triumph, no rescue witnessed by crowds, no victory that can be dated and celebrated. It produces instead an absence, the absence of wrecks that did not happen, of ships that found their way home instead of onto rocks. And absences of this kind are notoriously difficult to honor because they leave no visible trace of what was prevented. The keepers understood this better than anyone. They knew that the measure of their success was invisible, was made of all the nights when nothing happened, when ships passed safely in the dark and never knew or cared to wonder about the person who had climbed a tower in the wind to make certain the light did not fail. There is something in this that speaks to a larger truth about the relationship between human beings and the vast indifference of the natural world, a truth that the keepers lived out more literally than most. The sea does not know or care whether a light is burning. It will drown a ship whether or not a warning was given, and it will spare a ship whether or not any human hand labored to protect it. The keepers built their towers and tended their lights, not because the sea demanded it of them, but because they demanded it of themselves, an act of quiet defiance against an indifference too vast to be moved by any gesture, however sustained, however faithful. This is perhaps the truest description of what it meant to keep a light, to perform, night after night, a labor that the object of your care could never acknowledge, could never reward, could never even notice, and to do so anyway because the alternative, allowing the darkness to go unchallenged, was unthinkable. There is a dignity in this that does not depend on recognition. A form of service that asks nothing of the world in return for what it gives, and if history has been slow to fully honor the keepers, it may be because their labor resists the kind of narrative that history usually prefers. Of villains defeated and victories won, the keepers fought no one. They simply stood night after night between the dark and the ships that might otherwise have been lost to it, and asked for nothing beyond the wages that kept their families fed and the quiet certainty that their work mattered even when no one was watching to confirm it. If there is a final image to hold on to, let it be this. A tower standing alone on a headland where the land runs out into water, its light turning in the dark exactly as it has turned for 100 years or more, sweeping its beam across a sea that has swallowed ships and spared others with the same vast indifference it has always shown. The beam catching for a moment on the white crest of a wave, on the black shape of a passing hull, on nothing at all, and then turning away again, patient, unhurried, indifferent itself now to whether a hand or a machine is responsible for its burning. Somewhere below, if it is an old station, the keeper's house stands empty, or nearly so, its windows dark, its rooms holding only the memory of the people who once moved through them, wound the clockwork, climbed the stairs, watched the water. And if it is a station where the tower itself has been decommissioned, entirely allowed to go dark, because the shipping lane shifted or the technology moved on, then perhaps there is only the tower's silhouette against the sky, unlit now, its lens perhaps removed to a museum where visitors can stand close to it and see how large and how strange and how beautiful the great glass eye truly was, this thing that a family once devoted their whole lives to keeping alight. Either way, lit or dark, tended or empty, these towers remain as monuments to a form of labor that asked for patience above all else, that offered no glory and expected none, that simply insisted night after night on the presence of light where there might otherwise have been only darkness and the sound of water against rock. It is a form of service worth remembering, not because it was extraordinary in any dramatic sense, but precisely because it was not. because it was carried out by ordinary people who chose, or found themselves called to, a life of quiet vigilance against the sea's old and patient hunger, and who kept that vigilance faithfully until the world no longer required it of them. If this quiet history has offered you some comfort tonight, some place for your thoughts to rest as the hour grows late, then perhaps you will return again another evening for more of these gentle chronicles, more voices carried forward from towers and ships and shorelines where ordinary people once lived out extraordinary patience. Until then, may your own night be calm, your own light steady, and your rest, like the sea after a long storm, undisturbed.